Well, welcome back to ECT, everybody. My name is Andy Cooper with Environmental Consulting and Technology Incorporated. We are a consulting firm with 22 offices across the United States, and I'm based here in Chicago. We appreciate you all joining us. As you know, this is our third lecture of a 5-part series on environmental law and policy, which is a basic overview of environmental regulations in the United States. This series is being hosted throughout the month of October 2020. Our speaker is Mr. Mark Richardson, a former assistant prosecuting attorney for water quality in Macomb County in Michigan, and he's also an adjunct professor of environmental law at Oakland University in Southeast Michigan. Today's 1-hour lecture will focus upon the federal toxic and hazardous substances. For everyone listening, please post your questions to the chat box, and I will lead a question and answer session during the last 15 minutes. Please go ahead and mute yourselves as well. For starters today, we've asked Mr. Richardson to clarify a topic that came up during last week's presentation regarding the waters of the United States 2015 and 2020. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Mark, and thank you again for leading this great talk.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, I'd like to start with elaborating a little bit on an answer I gave to a question at the end of last week's session. I was asked about where the 2020 rule was being enforced and where it wasn't. I speculated that there was that there could be a nationwide injunction against the 2020 rule. I went too far with that statement. As of today, the 2020 rule is not being enforced in Colorado. There's an injunction against it that's effective in Colorado. Everywhere else, it is being enforced. Let me add that there are about 6 lawsuits or so seeking to overturn the 2020 rule. It is entirely possible that injunctions could be issued in other jurisdictions. I would recommend that people contact their Corps of Engineers district office if they have any questions about which rule is in effect going forward. So I hope that clears that up a little bit. Shouldn't trust my memory, should trust my notes. Today, we're going to be talking about federal government regulation of toxic and hazardous substances. I don't have a whole lot of time to get through 4 incredibly lengthy and complicated laws. Hopefully I'll be able to do enough justice to each one of them to give you an idea of how they work and serve perhaps as a basis for further questions. So I'm talking about substances, and there are really 3 stages at which the federal government intervenes to regulate hazardous substances. One is at the marketing stage, where these substances are actually being introduced to the marketplace in products and for use in industrial processes and so on. The second phase is where a portion of these substances become waste products. They're discarded. The government regulates how that waste is treated, stored, and disposed. And finally, the government acts where hazardous substances have been improperly disposed of or otherwise contacted the environment in a way that poses a risk to human health or the environment. So turning to the first phase, and let's go to the next slide, please. We want to talk about 2 major laws. The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, and the Toxic Substances Control Act. Now, these are laws which regulate the marketing phase of hazardous or toxic substances. The government here is acting as a gatekeeper. attempting to determine whether products containing these substances are safe as long as they're used as intended. The FIFRA law pertains to pesticides, and because pesticides are poison by definition, they deserve a separate law. TSCA, or Toxic Substances Control Act, is basically a catch-all that covers an enormous number of toxic substances contained in an enormous number of products, not necessarily limited to one industry or one business or another. Let me focus on the basics of how these laws work and then talk about the differences between them. How does the government function as a gatekeeper here? It requires that manufacturers of pesticides and other toxic substances or products containing toxic substances notify the government prior to introducing the substances into the marketplace. In FIFRA, it's called registration. In the TSCA law, it's called pre-manufacturer notification. And with this notification, the manufacturer is supposed to provide all of the research, all of the data, everything it has within its knowledge pertaining to the degree of risk connected with the use of the substance, whether it's exposure to human beings or risks to the environment. The difference between the two laws, the major difference is where the burden of proof lies. In FIFRA, it's up to the manufacturer to justify, if you will, the safety of the product, and the EPA functions as a kind of a judge, if you will, of the adequacy of the information. However, if EPA determines that there's going to be no unreasonable adverse effects on human health or the environment from the intended use of the pesticide, then approval is mandatory. Approval under FIFRA is not permanent. It's temporary. It lasts for 5 years. The reason for that is to accommodate additional research, additional knowledge that's developed about these substances after they're actually used. After 5 years, they have to be re-registered. The manufacturer has to go through the whole process again. This is a tremendously burdensome process on the government. There's over 50,000 pesticides currently registered under FIFRA. Can the government withdraw permission to use a pesticide that's been proven unsafe or there are serious concerns about? Yes, that's called cancellation. That would be permanent removal from the marketplace. That's a very lengthy and complicated trial-like process. There's also a process for more immediate action called suspension. And some examples of pesticides that have been removed from the marketplace through the suspension process are 2,4,5-T Silvex, ethylene dibromide, and Dynacet. These are the only 4 substances that have ever been removed through the suspension process. Don't ask me any questions about the characteristics of those substances other than they have really creepy sounding names. So I think that there's probably reason to be concerned about them. As far as TSCA is concerned, Toxic Substances Control Act, as I mentioned, it's a catch-all. And there is a tremendous amount of chemicals and products containing chemicals and other substances that are introduced into the marketplace every year. 1,500 or so a year, it's been estimated. 100 million tons of this material manufactured every year. I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by this material, but these are estimates. Nobody really knows for sure how much of an impact on the marketplace toxic substances that are regulated under this law have. And as I mentioned, it works similar to FIFRA in that the manufacturer is supposed to notify the government prior to use, and The difference is that it's up to the burden is on the EPA to show that the substance is unsafe or unreasonably safe. And the law doesn't give EPA very much time to do that. If we're talking about a low volume of manufacture of the chemical, less than 1,000 kilograms per year, EPA has 21 days to make that determination, 45 days for all others. The EPA does have the power to delay these deadlines if it determines that there's not enough information available to make an intelligent decision about the risks posed by these substances. But the history of the law demonstrates that, by and large, a tremendous amount of problematic substances have been approved under TSCA in a more or less rubber stamp fashion. And that actually led to a major amendment to the law just 4 years ago, the Lautenberg Act, where Congress mandated that the EPA actually take the inventory of all of the chemicals that had been previously approved under this law, which dates back to the 1980s, and using the following criteria, prioritize them for study. And the criteria is persistence and bioaccumulative character, susceptible population groups, geographic concerns, conditions of use, and volumes. In other words, take the real world history of the use of these chemicals and where they're being used, who they affect, and any data that's been developed about their toxicity, and decide which ones are the most important ones to study. And then the amendment gives the EPA 3 years to conduct additional studies, at which time it might withdraw approval or issue regulations further governing how the chemical will be used. Under both laws, the EPA has the power to either approve the use, deny the use, or impose conditions on the use of, be it a pesticide or other toxic substance containing material. And this is a process which lags behind the marketplace. There's no question about it. The number of approvals which are based on sketchy or less than adequate evidence, the burden on the agencies has been a real problem for governing these substances. Do I have time to share an anecdote? Let me just talk about one, asbestos. In addition to reviewing under the pre-manufacture notification process, the EPA can independently review substances which have already been approved. It can go back, just like it's doing under the Lautenberg Act. The EPA decided to do that for asbestos, and the agency spent 10 years studying the use of asbestos, compiled an administrative record 45,000 pages long, 45,000 pages, and decided that no use of asbestos was safe. All uses of asbestos should be banned. Asbestos manufacturers took the agency to court. The court agreed with the manufacturers in a case called corrosion-proof fittings. And what the court said was that 45,000 page record was not adequate, that the EPA had not studied enough different scenarios where asbestos was used, and therefore their decision to ban it was arbitrary. That gives you some flavor for what the government's up against in these kinds of scenarios. The Lautenberg law may help because it does mandate studies similar to the asbestos study that I gave you. Let's see. We have about a half hour left. A word about how the agency makes the determination what to do with pesticides and other substances. What both of these laws say is that the agency has to determine whether the use of these substances is reasonable or not. And the way that's determined is through the use of cost-benefit analysis. And I don't have time to explain all the ins and outs of cost-benefit analysis here, but that's basically a process by which all of the costs of regulating a use are added up, and all the benefits of using that substance are added up. And if the benefits outweigh the costs, then the use can be approved. If not, then the use should not be approved. Very simple in theory. There are an awful lot of more or less arbitrary assumptions built into cost-benefit analysis. However, and some of the more controversial ones have to do with the need to monetize every cost and every benefit, including those for which market-related data don't exist. Bottom line, if I were to tell you that it cost $10 million to save one additional life, and then I told you that that one additional life was worth $6 million, would the answer be no, don't save that additional life? That's the dilemma that you encounter in using cost-benefit analysis. Nevertheless, the law mandates its use in these determinations. There's a lot of room for playing around with the costs and the benefits that are calculated. I wish I could talk more about that, but I just can't at this point. I need to move on, and I want to move on beyond the gatekeeper marketplace keeping function here to the waste disposal function. Next slide, please. We'll go to the next slide. Thank you. And this is the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, another long and tortuously complex law. RCRA was passed in 1976, and its purpose was to avoid the kind of nightmare scenarios that America found occurring in that time. Prior to this, hazardous waste had been locally regulated, if at all. There were all kinds of unsafe storage and disposal areas. There still are. There's been estimated about 100,000 sites across the country are sites where regulated hazardous waste is disposed of or in a manner which would be illegal today. 100,000 sites. So we wanted to avoid that going into the future. So the idea here is identify what a hazardous waste is, and then assure that its fate is documented cradle to grave, and that it's disposed of in a licensed disposal facility. And that way we'll know how much waste is being generated, where it's gone, and what's happened to it, and there'll be no more illicit sites around the country. By its terms, RCRA regulates far more than just hazardous waste. It regulates all waste, actually, and its focus is on the hazardous constituent of the waste stream. So the first question to answer when we're talking about RCRA is, what is a hazardous waste? What gets regulated as a hazardous waste under subtitle C of the law, this enormously complex law. Well, I'm not big on bringing in definitions to these lectures because they can be confusing, but they can also be amusing. So here's the statutory RCRA definition of a solid waste. A hazardous waste must be a solid waste before it can be a hazardous waste. That's how the law works. First, it's a solid waste. Then we apply further tests to see if it's a hazardous waste. What's a solid waste? Any garbage, refuse, sludge from a wastewater treatment plant or air pollution control facility and other discarded material, including solid, liquid, semi-solid, or contained gaseous material, resulting from industrial, commercial, mining, and agricultural operations, and from community activities. Community activities are municipal solid waste, right? Well, if we're listening carefully to that definition, we learn that a solid waste can be a liquid, or it can be semi-gaseous, or it can be semi-solid. So solid doesn't really mean solid under this law. Why is that? The idea here is to prevent a waste from being regulated by the generator of the waste converting it from one state to another by, say, diluting solid waste or by heating it up so that it gasifies. You want to regulate the waste before that happens. So you have to have a sweeping definition of what a waste is. For a long time, when the law was first passed, there was a debate over the words discarded material. Did that mean waste that was intended to be recycled was regulated under this law? We saw the growth of an awful lot of waste piles around the country that they said were going to be recycled material. After a while, the EPA got wise to what was going on and narrowed the definition of a recycled material to just include what we call that used in closed loop recycling. In other words, if you're going to recycle a material, it may not be a discarded material like this definition says, but it has to be stored on at the site of generation. It has to be reincorporated into the manufacturing process within a short period of time to qualify as a non-discarded material. Okay, so we have solid waste. What makes it hazardous? There's two ways. First, it could be a listed waste. The EPA maintains a laundry list of hundreds of substances that are automatically classified as hazardous waste. But it could also be considered a hazardous waste, classified as hazardous waste, if it features the characteristics of a hazardous waste. What are the characteristics of a hazardous waste? Waste products that cause or significantly contribute to increase in mortality or serious illness, or pose a substantial threat to human health or the environment when improperly treated, stored, or disposed of. Like every legal definition, this definition has exceptions. The major one is for so-called household hazardous waste. There's also an exception for agricultural fertilizer hazardous waste. In other words, waste that's in the household waste stream, which might otherwise meet the definition I've just given you, is nevertheless not regulated under subtitle C. The reasons are just practicality. It's not feasible to extend the tentacles of this law into everybody's house. Household hazardous waste is regulated, if at all, at the state or the local level, not by this law. Those are the definitions. Those are the major exclusions. How do we know that a waste might feature the characteristics I've just given you? There are basically four factors that the agency relies on to make that determination. Ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, and toxicity. Ignitability means under normal conditions that the waste might be found. I'll just mention quickly toxicity. The usual method of determining that is a test called the TCLP test, and that's basically a measure of how toxic a waste remains after permeating through a landfill-like substances. In other words, think of piling a pile of sand on a table, and then you take a pitcher with some liquid in it that might be hazardous. You pour it over that sand. Whatever's coming down at the bottom of that sand pile, you then evaluate, and if it still meets toxic standards for that particular kind of substance, then it's regulated as a hazardous waste. The generator of waste has got the initial responsibility to make these determinations. Is it a solid waste? Is it a hazardous waste? I also want to mention, just briefly, getting back to something I said before, in addition to the tightening up the recycling loophole, there are regulations that govern hazardous waste that's mixed with other solid waste or waste products that are derived from feedstocks, which include hazardous waste. These are called mixture and derived from rules, and they basically require that even if a waste is rendered non-toxic or not meeting the various toxicity levels for those kinds of materials, even if after the mixture it doesn't meet those levels, it's still considered a hazardous waste. It's still regulated as a hazardous waste. That can lead to anomalies. That can lead to some material being regulated under Subtitle C with very expensive disposal requirements that are actually less toxic than other materials which are not regulated as a hazardous waste. Okay, so we have hazardous waste. What do we do with it? The generator is responsible for making the determinations that I've talked about. The generator is responsible for the ultimate fate of that hazardous waste. And what the generator must do is deliver it to a licensed treatment, storage, or disposal facility. And it must use a licensed transporter to transport it to that facility. And it must initiate a paper trail to indicate how much waste is delivered to the transporter, when, and the transporter then takes that paperwork called a manifest and delivers it along with the waste load to the TSD facility. I'm sure that in today's world, when we say paper trail, we're talking about an electronic trail, but nevertheless, the idea is the same. We're going to keep track of every ounce, every pound of this waste, so none of it gets misplaced. What happens after it gets to one of these licensed treatment facilities? These are called TSD facilities in the trade, treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. What kind of facilities are they? They include containers, tanks, surface impoundments, waste piles, treatment units, landfills, incinerators, thermal treatment units, chemical, physical, and biological treatment units, and underground injection wells. There's ironies connected with this law. One of them is that TSD facilities, even though they're tightly regulated, can often cause environmental problems on their own, just by the nature of the business that they're in. And as a matter of fact, there are currently 3,700 TSD facilities of the type I just gave you, that are under some sort of corrective action plan imposed by the EPA to clean up illicit or unauthorized releases of waste to the environment. I'm going to have to move on. Let me just say that the favored type of TSD facility in the past was landfills. In recent years, it's moved toward more toward incineration or injection wells. And one reason for that is that there is a technology-based requirement for pre-treatment of a wide variety of wastes before they even can be landfilled. Those include dioxins, furans, non-containerized liquids, heavy metals above specified concentration limits, acids below pH 2, PCBs, and halogen-jaded, if I pronounce that right, organic compounds. That's a universe of waste right there. Can't be landfilled unless it's pre-treated with a technology-based standard called Best Demonstrated Technology, or BDAT. That's expensive. It's led to increased use of incinerators. Okay, I have to move on to the last major law that I want to cover. So there we go. We've got to this right slide. The Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act. Circa Sarah, we fondly call it the Superfund law. First thing to know about Superfund is there is no Superfund in Superfund. There used to be. When the law was initially passed in 1979, there was a tax imposed on the petrochemical industry to provide a fund for the cleanup, immediate and otherwise, of sites of where there were illicit releases of toxic and hazardous substances. That fund was, the Congress failed to renew that tax, and that fund was exhausted, I think, around 2010. Now cleanups are funded strictly by general tax dollars, plus in the main settlements with the persons responsible for the waste conditions at these sites. I mentioned the 100,000 sites figure. In order to be for Superfund to apply, I'm just going to call it Superfund for jollies here. In order for Superfund to apply, a site has to be put on a list called the National Priorities List, and states typically identify their sites and they apply to the federal government for inclusion on this list. There are about 2,000 sites around the nation that are on this list. They are the Superfund sites. They are the ones that are involved in the process I'm going to describe to you. In a sense, this is just the tip of the iceberg, but these are supposed to be the worst sites in the country. They are put on the list using a set of criteria which is designed to identify the worst sites. Okay, so the site has to be put on the list. The other way a site can be eligible for assistance under Superfund is in an emergency response scenario. There's really two pots of money that we're talking about in Superfund. One is for long-term cleanup of NPL sites. The other is emergency responses. These are your tanker truck explosions. These are your spills. These are your where you know, an illicit waste disposal site is just discovered, and their immediate steps must be taken to secure the site or to remove waste that's threatening people or the environment. That's generally funded with tax dollars, but ultimately those costs can be recovered So that's the emergency response function. Most of the vigorish in this law pertains to long-term cleanups of NPL sites. Next slide, please. Superfund is a law which go back to the other slide. I'm sorry. Superfund is a law which borrows a lot from other laws. For example, how do I identify whether or not a site contains hazardous substances? Superfund borrows definitions of hazardous substances from RCRA and the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, other laws. It doesn't have its own separate definitions. So definition isn't an issue. Being on the NPL is an issue for long-term cleanups. How does the long-term cleanup process work? The statute provides an elaborate step-by-step process for assessing site conditions and developing a cleanup plan for the site. And there's actually nine steps in this process. I don't think I'm going to walk through 9 separate steps with you, but know that the first 2 of these steps are initial screening steps, and the last 2 steps are kind of tweaking or adjustment type steps. And the middle 5 steps are what we call balancing steps. And what are these screening steps all about? First of all, we have to assess site conditions, and this is called remedial investigation, or RI. And we go out to the site, secure it, then you explore what's going on at the site. And all these sites are different. You might have a wetland with pipes going in it. You might have old mine shafts that are filled with God knows what. You might have a waste pile. You might have the old town dump. Just all kinds of things. I think it's fair to say that groundwater contamination is probably the #1 pathway that these cleanup plans are focused on, but it's certainly not exclusive. You can have air pollution hazards from these sites if contaminated soil blows around in dust storms. There's lots of different potential pathways. I think groundwater is probably the predominant concern, though, of Superfund site cleanups. Once you've assessed the site, you start going through cleanup alternatives. And the first 2 of the 9 criteria: does the alternative protect human health and environment overall? Does the alternative comply with ARARs and other laws? What's an ARAR? Applicable, relevant, and appropriate regulation. That's what an ARR is. Superfund, as I said, borrows from other laws, and it borrows cleanup standards from other laws. And these can be not only federal laws, but any applicable state level laws. The most predominant example of an ARR would be the maximum contaminant levels in the federal safe drinking water law. Imagine having to clean up an old dump to the point where the groundwater is safe to drink. It's potable, meets those safe drinking water standards. That's an example of the challenge under the Superfund law. The balancing criteria, basically they boil down to long-term effectiveness, short-term effectiveness, and probably the most important one: does the alternative you're considering reduce toxicity, mobility, or volume through treatment? It's important to understand that in Superfund, there's a bias in these criteria for on-site treatment, for on-site remediation. The agency does not want to get in a position where it's simply digging up waste and transporting it to another site. That's kind of like taking a problem out of your backyard and putting it into someone else's backyard. So we see things like portable incinerators at these sites for the soils and the solid waste products. We see pump and treat options, and sometimes these last for years, these remedies. So I have to move on to the whole liability question. Who's responsible for the costs? The PERPs are responsible for the costs. Who are the PERPs? They are the potentially responsible parties. And those include not only those who dumped waste or who own the premises, but those who arranged for waste to be disposed of or treated at the site, either directly or indirectly, in other words, with middlemen. They also include parent and successor corporations. We want to reach, we're talking about sites that are sometimes 50 years old. We want to reach beyond who did what then to who we can get money from now. And it's not always possible to identify enough PERPs for every site to fully fund the cleanup, but we want to try and do that to the maximum extent we can. So liability here is very sweeping. Another aspect of this sweeping liability is that liability here is joint and several liability, and it's strict liability. Liability without fault. Joint and several liability means regardless of how much you contributed to the problem, you're potentially responsible for 100% of the cleanup costs. If you contributed 10% of the waste, you could still be forced to pay 100% of the costs. This is drastic liability. There are some ways of escaping liability. The most prominent one, the most important one, is the innocent landowner exception. Persons who did not know or did not have reason to know that there was a problem on their property at the time they acquired the property, or who are not in contract with anybody who was connected with dumping the waste there. This is a way of protecting the innocent landowner. This is a way of addressing the midnight dumper situation. In the real world, once the PERPs are identified, the government endeavors to reach settlements with the PERPs. There's often a committee appointed, and that committee is usually driven by the deeper pockets among the community of those who are responsible. That's why you see in Metro Detroit, for example, Ford, Chrysler, or General Motors is almost always involved at every Superfund site that you can find, no matter how much they actually contributed to the problem. The PERPs can adjust liabilities between themselves. They can even sue each other for contribution. They can try to allocate the responsibility through settlements or lawsuits. So they can adjust the liability between themselves, but they can't do it vis-a-vis the government. So I'm out of time here. I just want to say that the law has been in effect now for 40 years, and there's been a total of over 2,000 sites on it. There's currently 2,000 sites. How many sites have actually been cleaned up under this law? 413 sites as of last year. The reasons, you can probably paint a mental picture of just how involved these investigations and the negotiations are with the PERPs, and how expensive it is to actually perform these cleanups. All of that leads to a very slow pace under this law. I hope I've done justice to these topics. I always feel like I'm kind of rushing through, but I'm ready to take any questions that people have.
Thanks, Mark. That was fantastic. We
Okay.
do have a couple questions, and I want to point everyone out in the chat. Sanjeev has added a couple quizzes to test our knowledge. So make sure you take a look at those and test yourself after this talk. So question number one. Let's see. Love Canal is a well-known Superfund site. And if you remember its details, can you share where it is, who was responsible, what contamination was involved, etc.?
So Love Canal is a neighborhood located in a town located on, I believe it's Grand Island in the Niagara River in the state of New York. And for a long time, Hooker Chemical Company operated a chemical manufacturing plant in the vicinity. The plant closed, and the land was eventually sold for residential real estate development, and the neighborhood was constructed, complete with schools and boulevards and all the accoutrements of a residential neighborhood. However, in the middle to late 1970s, some disturbing things started happening. Rusting 55-gallon drums began to pop up out of the soil in the school playground. And nobody seemed to be aware that, you know, of what had been going on there in prior years. I think Hooker had been there since the First World War. So an investigation was launched, and it was basically found that the entire neighborhood was built over a hazardous waste dump. Chemical residues were a huge quantity of 55-gallon drums were buried under what became the neighborhood. And as a result, the soils were found to be extraordinarily contaminated. I've forgotten what substances were prominent. I imagine there's heavy metals as well as toxic organics. But the neighborhood had to be abandoned, and at the end of the day, there was litigation, and the residents were bought out and compensated. But that was an incident, a very well-known incident that actually led to the passage of one of the incidents that led to the passage of the Superfund law.
Great, thank you. No more questions in the chat. Please, if you have any, go ahead and pop them in. Another one we have is in our neck of the woods near the Clinton River. The contaminated sites are designated as AOCs, not as Superfund sites. Can you describe why that is?
The AOC process is the result of an international agreement between the United States and Canada. And under that agreement, the respective governments agreed to designate sites that were especially contaminated around the Great Lakes. Some of the problems with AOC sites have been traced to Superfund sites. For example, there are two larger Superfund sites on the Clinton River, just upstream of the mouth. They're in Shelby Township. The names of the sites are escaping me right now, but there's two rather large Superfund sites, just a few miles from upstream from the river. So I think it's fair to say that areas of concern are larger geographically than Superfund sites. Superfund sites are discrete sites where specific problems are uncovered, but they contribute to conditions substandard conditions that lead to areas being designated areas of concern. So I kind of hope that helps.
Mark, this is John O'Mara. I
Oh, hi.
actually am up in the area, and I do kind of handle a lot of the AOC work, and I'll help you out because I know the answer to that one.
Okay.
Biggest, and the reason behind it is the area concern program basically is not a contaminated site program. To an extent of what you indicated, there could be areas within the AOC that are site-specific issues, Superfund or state identified. But the AOC program more or less was set up to say this area is not equivalent to other areas around it. It doesn't mean that it has to ever go back to being pristine or anything. It just means those areas are a little worse off because of a number of what they call beneficial use impairments. And that could be, there isn't fish and wildlife habitat anymore in the area. So there is a difference.
Yeah, that is helpful. The environmental problems in an area of concern extend beyond toxic contamination, although it certainly can include, for example, in the Clinton sediments is a
is that one of the BUIs? Yes,
that's
yeah.
one of the BUIs.
Yeah.
So I guess bottom line is AOC that's a more comprehensive classification than Superfund is intended to address.
Yeah.
But thank you. That's good.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you, Mark. Any other questions? We will go ahead and send these 2 quizzes out, the links. So look for that in your email, and we'll put them on the source as well. And as you know, these are being recorded, so we will get those loaded onto the source for those of us that want to come back and re-listen or didn't have the chance to listen prior. So thank you very much, and I invite you to come back next Friday for lecture 4, where we will discuss the Federal Clean Air Act. Everyone, thank you, and have a great afternoon.